the United States and Iran. This week at my lectionary study group, a large portion of our discussions centered around the topics of how should Christians react toward opposing ideologies. We found ourselves discussing the merits of taking up arms, of preemptive aggression, and of passive resistance, i.e., martyrism versus fighting to protect one's life. Jesus did say to Peter in the Garden of Gethsemane to put down his sword, for those who live by the sword die by the sword. In that discussion, I was reminded of what Miroslav Volf, professor of theology and director of the Yale Center of Faith and Culture at Yale University, said at a retreat that I had attended 8 years ago on Christians taking up arms. Dr. Volf is the son of a Croatian Pentecostal minister, and as a youth, Serbia was still under control of the USSR, so he was often harassed, as was his father, by the communist government. When he eventually migrated to the United States, he was appalled by the difference between the Serbian Pentecostal understanding of Scripture versus the United States Pentecostal Church's understanding of Scripture, as it viewed how to respond to conflict and aggression. In Croatia, one of the characteristics of being a Christian was passive resistance. He notes that in the United States, especially the evangelical Christian structure, the first response to persecution or aggression is to take up the sword or retaliate, citing the evangelical response to the attack of the World Trade Center in 2001. He sees a large segment of the United States church as not being consistent with the expectations of being a servant of God's precepts. So, the basic issue that we were discussing is, what is God's expectation of someone that he is in covenant with? We as followers of Jesus the Christ means that we have entered into covenant with him. In the same way, when we are baptized into that covenant. When we join as a member of a congregation, we are agreeing to live within a covenant of that congregation. Jesus, as he announced his ministry to the elders of the synagogue, used Isaiah chapter 61 as his understanding to be in covenant with God's precepts by saying, here are the qualities that God calls his servant: a messenger to preach good news to the poor, and to heal the wounds of the brokenhearted, to tell captives that you are free, and to tell prisoners, be free from your darkness. Jesus uses writings of the prophet Isaiah because it is in Isaiah that the covenant of God is coming in the form of an actual person. Previously, God's covenants had been promised through abstract ideas. And what I mean by that is, think of the 23rd Psalm as being the best example of what God's covenant was. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow, I shall fear no evil, for thine shall be with me. Okay? You prepare a table before me. God is doing all of these things as a covenant. But they were ideas. Whereas we look to Isaiah as the foretelling of a physical Messiah. So in chapter 42, we can learn what the behavior of a physical covenant is to be. So these are the things that living in covenant with God are. A servant is clothed in God's Spirit. Through God's strength, the servant will cause justice to spring up for the nations. Covenant living will be gentle and will not quarrel with others in public and will not exalt his own voice. And I take that to understand of one's own ego. It sounds a lot like what Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, as we refer to the love chapter. Living in covenant means not crushing a broken heart or disregarding the weak and vulnerable, but making sure justice comes to those who are wronged. Living in covenant, based on the strength of God, allows for one's inner being to not become faint or discouraged, nor will one's light grow dim. So the question then becomes, how do we who profess to be followers of Christ live into this covenant that obviously speaks of being passive in resistance in a culture that encourages physical retaliation? Within our own country, civility has broken down to a point that the ability to have an exchange of ideas as a form of understanding one another is no longer the norm. We have become a people who want to express our opinions based on our ego, and when our opinion is threatened, lash out in words meant to demean those who do not agree with us. Character assassination has become the sword of our day. It is increasingly harder to recognize truth from the non-truth, or what we now refer to as an alternative truth. As we look to the second half of today's reading, we see what God expects from his servant. From the one God sends as a covenant to his people. God says he has commissioned us in righteousness to succeed and will take our hand in love and watch over us. God recognizes us as his servant, the physical covenant for the world, as the walking light for others. Our mission is to open blind eyes, to set prisoners free from dark dwellings, and to open prison doors to those who are held in darkness. The idea of all these perfections of God's precepts has moved from the abstract to the physical through a human of God's choosing. We as Christians have recognized this person as Jesus the Nazarene. As followers of this man, we in essence become the extension of Christ, who is the extension of God. Living in covenant means that we are to be about a specific behavior. As images of God, as images, each of us as the image of God, we cannot leave the responsibility of God's power in presenting light to the world just to Jesus alone. We as a covenant people are that light to the darkness. When Yolanda Nuncio spoke to us this last November, I appreciated her view of who we are as a congregation that is inclusive. This is a truth about living in covenant and striving to live into the covenant that God speaks about as that physical covenant to the world. Beloved, we as followers of Christ have struggled and will continue to struggle about how we live out being servants of God, of what it means to live in covenant. And that's okay. Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane also struggled with what it meant for him to live in covenant. But in the world so full of confusion, we can be assured of what God's precepts are for those who follow God. For Jesus, living out God's precepts meant passive resistance and giving of his life on the cross as he worked towards cultivating justice. And you know what? We have that physical reminder in our church of the power of Jesus. It's hanging right here at the center of our sanctuary. The most profound reminder of God's power in our world is that of the cross. So my question to you to think about this week is this: what does living in covenant mean to you? And how will you continue to live into that meaning?